I'm from the business sector more than the academic part, and I have, let's call it a 360 overview about the actual economic situation. And this presentation is made specially for you, in the idea that you should see how things really are at this moment, and especially because of the actual economic context, not only regarding the Russian-Ukrainian war, but also regarding the perspective Europe has to become great again, let's call it this way, although it's not a polite concept today to talk about make Europe great again, but it should be mega, let's call it this way. Now, today's talk is more about the idea that at one point, although the communitarian principles of the European Union are to keep all members at the same level and try to push for those that are lagging behind to get in front, it's kind of weird because today's environment doesn't allow to have this type of behavior towards your emerging partners, especially in the EU. And it's quite important because there's a tension between social welfare and high-performance governance. Now, the idea of social welfare is a common goal when it comes to what the government should be for any entity. It doesn't matter if it's a country, a region, or in this case, the European Union. You have to push for the concept of social welfare and the idea that you don't want to have some individuals left behind, and you also want to push on the verge of bringing together the best minds that they can fulfill the needs of the people and the economy right now. Now, it's quite important to understand that not only social welfare is important, but high-performance governance. Why? Because in these days of economic instability, let's call it in a polite way instability, we have the need to develop a new way of thinking, and this means also being cutthroat. And this is not something that the European side sees, but it's also from the need to compete with the American side. Now, last year at another blended intensive program, someone asked me, one of the professors asked me that, why should we compete with the Americans? Why should we have this perception of trying to compete on every level? Well, if we don't try to become more competitive, we'll be left behind, and this means the level of development and the welfare, the common welfare, will be obsolete soon. And at one point, because you don't perform at the level you should perform, you'll have a big issue. And that issue is the purpose of the European Union is going to be gone. And the purpose of having a united front in front of the necessities of having issues like the actual Ukrainian war. Now, although this presentation doesn't dig in the idea of the war, it has as main purpose the concept behind where Europe is right now, where it was, and where it should be soon enough to be at the same level with the Americans especially. Now, the main issues that Europe faces right now are the following. First of them is resource allocation. Now, resource allocation is quite weird, because many countries, part of the EU, have a weird and difficult procedure to go through. They first have to demonstrate they won't impact the environment, and then maybe they will be allowed to exploit their own resources. Now, last year, when I was at the World Economic Forum in Davos, at one point in an informal setting, all the big guys, most of them combined, controlled around $80 trillion in assets. So that's a lot. Now, 80 trillion in assets is not the same like you evaluate GDP or macroeconomic values. It has a different scale. It sounds a lot, it is a lot, but it's not that a lot compared to the economic potential of countries. This is business-wise. And at one point they said the following, one of them said the following, dude, what should we do if we don't want to do this anymore? This anymore would mean following the SDGs, the ESGs, so everything regarding sustainability is kind of toxic for huge companies because it eats their profits. And at one point, we developed this tension. Where should I be and where I am right now? And because you don't want to pay for other people's happiness, so you don't want to pay for other people's happiness, you will push on the idea that you want to have more for you right now. Because you don't see it. And big companies, when they realize that following sustainability, following the purpose of especially the EU in having a better future for our children, this means also giving up to almost 80% of your profits. Why? Because sustainability costs a lot and you don't see it. And it's only something for the future generations. And because of this tension, they would proudly go for the idea of reducing their push on economic values for right now, for having a better purpose right now. So resource allocation is quite weird because the EU and the UN also, and all the organizations, all the NGOs are pushing for the concept just because they think it's a good thing to have. But at the end of the day, all the players at the same table should play by the same rules. And if Europe goes for the idea of being sustainable, but in the same time China or the US right now, they will try to push for the best option available without taking in consideration future generations, then unfortunately we have to somehow go on the same path for a while, otherwise we will be far left behind. Now, political constraints. Well, we can dig in this concept of political constraints, but it's more about seeing the ideology behind the ideology. So, one of them is what they sell to the general public. Either it's left versus right. Either it's woke versus and progressism versus traditional values. Either it's nationalistic values versus globalism. It doesn't matter at the end of the day. The problem is these are sellouts. These are concepts sold to the general public just to get their vote. When the deal closes, when the elections are done, no one cares about these facts. Just they want to push on the idea they go on that path, but they follow their initial agenda. The initial agenda is always the one that sells at the end of the day. And by selling, it means it generates the necessary push to create future generations of political factors to establish an agenda, although they don't care about those values. If you want to see the best example, look at the Brexit. No one cared about that. But because it went on a negative path, and because they didn't highlight all the factors included in the process, at the end of the day, with a small margin, the United Kingdom went haywire and got out of the European Union. Was this their plan? No. Not even the far right, though those that were for the plan, they didn't care about it. They just wanted to get elected, they wanted to follow a process, and that was it. When they realized what happened, they actually realized that the data was wrong. So keep in mind, data is quite important when it comes to political constraints, because it can generate monsters. Those monsters are developed when ideology meets low educational process. And by the way, one of the biggest issues that we have today is the fact that the educational process is so low in quality. You have to think about the fact this is a global issue. Even the Americans, for a long time, they thought that the guys from Iowa are the most illiterate people from the US. But actually, their educational issues grew so much that today they only know that Massachusetts is okay in educational perspective, and the others lag behind. So see how it went from Iowa is the illiterate state to today when we know that Massachusetts is good. So until now they had 49 states that were doing okay and one of them lagging behind. Now it's one that's doing okay and 49 that are nowhere. And this is what happens when you push for a poor educational process and poor financing process of the educational process. And it's not about paying salaries. It's about developing the tools to deliver to students from kindergarten to, I don't know, postdoc, to have the best tool, to have their own ideas, to develop their own values and research on that. It's not norming them, because this is what happens to today's education. They try to norm everything. For a long while, since the 40s till 2018, Ivy League universities, they push for the idea of having the best specialists in their field. And then they realize they have so many specialists that no one sees the bigger picture. And now they switched. But each time you switch, you actually have to adapt. And when you adapt, that costs a lot of time. And I say costs a lot of time because time is actually more important than money in some cases. Now, when it comes to technological and economic disruptions, that's where Europe performs the worst. So the first three are bad, but the last one is the worst. Why? Because although it followed the idea to protect data and information of the end user, they went on and pushed for something that's called GDPR. Now you know the GDPR is a procedure in which your data is protected and you have to follow some rules if you're a company to use your users' data. Now, unfortunately, by doing this, something happened. They pushed the brake pedal to the floor because it has to generate an extra layer of cost for the company to adapt. And the worst case scenario is actually what's happening to Apple Intelligence, which is not available in the EU, although it's on your phone if you have an Apple phone after the 15 version. Now the problem is, Apple Intelligence itself, it's a gimmick more than a real useful tool. But the problem at the end of the day, you cannot use it because it's so difficult for the legal team of Apple to understand the legal process of the European Commission and to adapt. And that's why instead of having this product from September 2024, you will have it in April 2025, just because it took almost 6 months to understand the adaptability process. They lost time, they lost efficiency, they lost a lot of cash in this process because they had to pay for a feature that you don't even see it. Meanwhile, you will see later on that when you do this at macroeconomic level, things become even worse, because by trying to push for data protection and by trying to regulate everything before it needs to be regulated just because you want to protect someone, it creates so many entry barriers for those companies that most of them, they either switch geographical positions to a better understanding area, or they just close shop. Now, the strategies that you need to follow, most of them are quite simple, and it's mostly connected to the way they position themselves as governments and the way they promote ideas like pushing for technological hubs. And this is one of the issues that we have right now. Well, to get a better understanding like how adaptability is, you just have to look at this graph. Now, this is how we use today oil and gas. So, I know Donald Trump loves the idea of drill, baby, drill, but at the end of the day, how much can you drill? You can divest, you can invent new technologies like shale gas. You can promote new extracting units for gas, especially because when you try to extract gas, most of it gets lost in the process. Meanwhile, with oil, it's an easier process because it's easier to extract. But the problem is that, as you can see, as time passes, our energy consumption becomes bigger and bigger. As you can see, we are somewhere here right now. And at the end of the day, it means each year the planet consumes about 100,000 terawatts hour. And this will continue until we will reach a mark of 100, almost 25,000 terawatts in the next future, in the near future. Now, for the next 35 years, there's a push of 25%. It doesn't mean the economy will grow by 25%. It will grow by 25% in general terms, but most of it will grow with a higher rate because it will have a better efficiency. Now, that's the problem, especially the Chinese industrialists do not follow. They don't care about the environment, not because they are narrow-minded. They don't care about the environment because the research to care about the environment is so expensive. And their business process is like this for the Chinese industrialists. See a good product, copy it, add 5% new features, make it better than the initial one, and repeat the process all along. And you do this several rounds, and at one point you get the skill to do it yourself. And when you have the skill to do it yourself, then you can actually innovate. And that's why, as you can see, Huawei and Xiaomi, they went from mobile phones, computers, home appliances, electric vehicles. Just because they understood the process, they repeat the process several rounds until they got to the position in which they are quite keen in developing the best features they can have. Will they be better than traditional companies like Mercedes-Benz, let's call it this way, or Ford? I'm naming these two because these two are the main igniters of the idea of having a personal car, Mercedes-Benz and Ford. Now, the problem is, it's the same for those that try to see Tesla as a car manufacturer. No. Tesla is an iPhone with wheels at first. As long as you don't see it like this, you are going to mistake the process for the fundamental analysis to invest in that company. Many individuals try to invest in Tesla and see it as a car manufacturer, but the problem is it's not being traditional. The only thing they actually innovated as a company is that they were the first to close all their dealerships and sell the cars by themselves online. That's it. There's nothing more. That is the only innovation Tesla has as a business. As a product, it's the efficiency of their magnets, the engine, and the battery pack. And the battery pack it's made and built in China. So even the battery pack is not theirs. So look, the beloved options of Donald, oil and gas. Drill, baby, drill. Now, you know what's the problem? Because although that's the fast transition scenario, in real life situation, it won't get to be like that. Why? Because coal, oil and gas, it's still available in huge quantities. The only issue is if we have the motivators to protect the future. And at the end of the day, at least until today, Europe is the last standing protector of the environmental future. But this is going to be the culprit if Europe fails as an entity that tries to push for the evolution of its own values. Now, as you can see, something happened. Something happened somewhere in 2015. That's when Europe lost it. It was losing the competitive game since 2005, but it got weirder and weirder. Why? Because the push for integrating and leaving no country behind was the main issue it had. Instead of doing a game like the Americans do, we have some laggards, some entities. It's either a company or a country that's lagging behind or it's muddling through, and we try to push them to be better. In Europe, the push to be better actually pushed the brake pedal for the countries that were evolving at its best. With an exception. That exception is Germany, because Germany was faking their own business model for a while. And now they are facing two options, Germany at this moment. Option number one, keep it this way, try to patch your business model as a country and get back on track, which means it will take a while, it will cost a lot, and it will create social pressure. Or join the dark side and enjoy a new version of the Nord Stream pipeline. And that's Germans' food for thought process today. They either go legit or go back to faking the model in the idea that at one point they will really make it. It's like having a cheat code in a game. When energy is almost free because it's from gas or oil, then you kind of cheat as a business. And to understand how low they went, at one point after they closed the coal mines and they have no more thermal power, they went on the idea of using oil to generate thermal power, which has efficiency only if you use coal. So the yield of coal in thermal power is somewhere 90%. The yield of oil in thermal power or gas is between 60 to 70%. And to actually create electric power from oil and gas by using old tools like thermal, you need to spend a lot. And you can spend a lot only if it's free. How can it be free? If it comes from Russia. But that's another story. Now, Europe has two issues. Itself and itself. Because the Americans are not an issue. Although it's a huge gap. By the way, we are $11 trillion behind the US right now. In 2015, 10 years ago, we were on the same path. We were, for 10 years, running side by side. But we were lagging behind already. You know why? The US wasn't pushing at its true potential from 2005 to 2015 because it had its US dollar devaluated, first of all by the economic crisis in 2007, and then through their own purposes by using the concept of helicopter money or quantitativism. That's the problem. They made their economy look bad because they wanted to push for a weaker dollar to look competitive by seeing them outside. And when they regained the strength, starting from 2005, then it actually showed the pace of the European economy. It's not about productivity. All specialists will tell you that it's about productivity. Now, even last year's September 2024 Mario Draghi report says it's about productivity. You'll see later on it's not about that. The gap between the EU and the US regarding productivity is only 1.5 trillion. The rest, 9.5 trillion, it's about a currency war and something extra. You'll see then. Now, I'm doing only the graphs because I have to keep it short. That's why my colleague told me that I have to compress from 80 minutes to 60 minutes. So, since 2008, that's the problem. $11 trillion in a productivity gap. That's how Mario Draghi calls it. Now, it's not a productivity gap. It's more a performance gap. We're not able to develop at the process we should be, at the level we should be, because first of all, you have to see how things really are in the data available 2008-2023 with the economies. We take Greece aside because Greece is still recovering to its true potential after the economic crisis. But as we can see, compared state by state, the best performing states from the US, because again, US is a federation. We benchmark states by states, not a huge entity with a so-called entity. Because again, who says you can actually evaluate the EU and the US one by one? They're wrong. The US is a 249 federation, and the EU is a 60-plus year community that tries to keep their shit together. But it's not like that. So, who are the key players, as you can see? Massachusetts, New York, California, Washington. These are the key players for the American economy. Where is Europe? We have Poland that performs quite well because they had the audacity to use both sides as concepts. So the Polish economy is, in the early 90s, they went through the Washington Consensus, and they gave them a shock therapy in which they developed faster, better, and became immune to the actual context of what a capitalist economy should be, going from communism. And after that, they were rewarded by the Americans through huge inflows of capital, of foreign direct investment, because they kept the pace they were told to be on. Meanwhile, they benefited from European funds, and at one point, they actually pulled a trick on the European funds solution by pushing and having the best infrastructure, roads infrastructure they could have, by decreting all roads as being national roads and being included in the European funds strategy. So that was one way of being smart about your actual position. So Poland is a very good example. Now, Again, one of the best performers is Finland. That's what the theory says. Finland is great. But when you look where Finland is right now, looks weird, right? Because each time Nordic economies are the best. And then you see them. There's Finland, there's Norway, there's Sweden, and that's kind of it. So, socially speaking, these economies, they look good. Qualitative values, social values, they are good. From an economic perspective, the Nordic economies are having the same issue the European Union has. They are lagging behind because they don't understand the process of performance versus social. It's good to be social as long as you can afford it. If you don't afford it, rewire the performance model and then recreate your social status as a country. The elephant in the room. Those 11 trillion that some say it's about productivity. Well, from those 11 trillions we lag the Americans. Only 1.5 is from productivity growth. 1 trillion is because until now the American economy has a better demographic performance. Why? Because when the quality of life is unstable, which this happens for the last 15 years, not only in the US, also in Europe, you need to understand that it's better to have an unstable quality of life when you're already rich than when you are an emerging entity. Because all European countries taken side by side, compared to the American countries, states, are emerging in financial power. That's why they have being better than you status level when they come to Europe. Because for them, although they love Europe, is like going back, because the level of development when it comes to financial output is way lower in all European economies, except the UK. The UK is a different type of breed in this case. But when it comes for continental Europe, they are performing at a lower pace and a lower rate than the American economy, just because they have a different approach on what being developed means. Now, Achilles' heel for the American economy. They spend a lot. They spend so much as a government that they are $34 trillion in debt. That's a lot of cash, $34 trillion. Now, if you evaluate the global GDP, that's $115 trillion. So the Americans, they already spent a third of global GDP on stuff. Usually wars, but that's another story. But they spend a lot. And they spend in an unsustainable way. It's so bad, although they blame NATO to being so expensive, it cost the American economy $860 billion. It's unofficial data, but because I'm also there, I can tell you last year that's how much the Americans spent. The official data is $730 billion 2 years ago, but last year it's $860 billion. Meanwhile, they pay in interest rates $1 trillion. So government interest rates are higher than how much the US Army costs, and they blame the US Army and NATO because the American economy is not competitive. Each year that passes, the American economy spends $1.4 trillion more than it can develop. So since we started talking, the Americans already spent 400 million they didn't have. And they say it's Europe's fault. Yeah. Now, this is one of the issues of the American economy, the shale oil and gas. Because although they promote the idea of having fancy tech to extract oil and gas, it's not yet proven to be the best solution in this case. And they lose each year $500 billion on oil and gas that they don't have. And the rest, almost $7 trillion, is the fact they pushed for a powerful currency from a weak currency. They switched the concept. That's why almost today it's almost $1.04 per euro, the parity between the two currencies. Now, where it matters, that's the problem. Because when you have the GDPR, which by the way, it's a good tool, but it's expensive to have. When you have the EU AI Act, and let me tell you a story about the EU AI Act. 3 years ago, the European Commission hired a Swiss-based entity to develop a backbone for the EU AI Act. As any good Swiss entity, they outsourced to another entity the product, and that entity was me. And me and my team gave them a tool in which we promoted the idea that you should wait until it catches on as a sector, the artificial intelligence sector in Europe, and then try to regulate it. Gave them the package, they said it's not okay, and they said they will do it in-house. Now, the team of Euro deputies that developed the product that you know as the EU AI Act is so poorly developed when it comes to protecting the environment of being a good company that develops the product that this happened. Well, as you can see, European startups are 50% less than American ones. Those that survive and try to make it better are even worse. For each European startup that consumed more than $15 million, there's 2.3 American ones. And if you go even further, to have companies that already combined investment more than 100 million, for each European startup, there are 7 American ones. Why? Because although deep fakes, although fake news, although common sense is not available in the online environment in the American way, it helps in creating big business. And today is not the time to have this type of views. Now, you have the Magnificent Seven. Alphabet or Google, Meta, Facebook, Tesla, because again, Tesla, although it sounds like a car, it's a phone. Amazon, Broadcom, Nvidia, and last but not least, Apple, Microsoft. Now, these companies, they don't innovate. They disturb the entire ecosystem by existing. Well, in Europe, their counterparts are only 2. LVMH, Louis Vuitton Moet Hennessy, and Novo Nordisk. which it's a pharmaceutical company that does lately diabetes drugs that make you skinny. So, although it looks nice, it's unproven if it's healthy all the way, but it's kind of weird because at the end of the day, you do not really have what it really takes to be the best in this environment. And Europe, by trying to push regulations after regulation, you can see the difference between being a $100,000 company to $1 trillion company. Novo Nordisk, a good day, it means it has a market cap of 700 billion. LVMH, 600 billion. Now both of them are around 400 billion today because shit happens, the economy doesn't work their way all the time. As you can see, all these companies, the Magnificent Seven, are built before 2008, which gives us a signal that the Americans, they actually forgot what innovation is too. But even if they forgot, they have the environment to push it through all the way, while the Europeans are not even there yet. We have ARM, we have Booking, Skype, which by the way, on 1st of May, Skype is gone. It's getting its shop closed, and it's going to be Microsoft Teams from that moment on. UiPath. Now this company is actually situated 4 blocks this way. UiPath, total disappointment. The company that does AI agents, but it never had actual profit in the last 4 years since it was listed. Klarna. Now Klarna is a good company until Apple introduced Apple Pay later. So see, when you fight a giant, they worked Klarna for several years to create a payment tool that could go worldwide. They made it better, they implemented it. The company was valuated at $80 billion. And 1.5 years ago, Tim Cook just said, introducing Apple Pay later. After this phrase, Klarna went from 80 billion to 20 billion in 1 minute. 1 minute. Because that's the problem. When you fight those guys, they can do you dirty and fast. That's the problem. Now, what do you think about Spotify? Do you have a Spotify subscription?
Yes.
What do you use? What do you use? Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube Music? So most of the people, except myself, use Spotify. Great tool. I see it as a better way of understanding yourself through its machine learning, what music should it deliver to you when you need it, depending on your mood. But they're not making it. They're like a good football player or soccer player. They're good, they score some beautiful goals. They talk about them. But their only true option to make it is to go into Saudi Arabia. They went to Real Madrid, they like them, but they're average at Real Madrid or Barcelona or whatever. They're like Robert Lewandowski. Bayern München, superstar. FC Barcelona, a star. Okay, you can say he's getting older or something like that. It's good, but at Bayern he was the superstar, yeah. But in today's environment, that's how Spotify is. It's getting there, and that's it. And it's losing it. Each day goes by, it's another day in which they don't demonstrate. Why is Volt Revolut? 3 companies that try to make it in a field in which Alphabet, Meta, or Apple didn't want to go in yet. If Apple or Alphabet would go and say, you know what, we like delivering products, Volt dies. If Apple says, we want to make a real bank, now they have the Apple card, which is actually a Goldman Sachs branded card. It's not an Apple true product. Then Revolut is going to cough. Now that's the problem. There's no European monster except Mistral AI, which is a French company that it looks good, it sounds good, but hopefully won't pull up ChatGPT. Because at one point, you don't know how to innovate anymore, and then you go on the marketing side. And you promise lots and lots of stuff until maybe you actually deliver. Yeah. So, this is how it actually looks. This is Europe. The bigger the business, the smaller the participation. And that's its main problem. Regulating everything kills the business. Let me give you a weird example. Now, in New York City, if you want to open up a restaurant, after you get all the documentation to sell alcohol, to do your dishes and so on, they will actually let you be for 1, maybe 1.5 years without sending someone to evaluate your business. Either it's the IRS, either it's the sanitation department. They will wait. Okay, if you start having people going to the hospital because they ate something bad, they will come fast. But otherwise, if you're good at your business, they will wait 1.5 years. Why? Because they want you to catch on, to get your roots really grounded, and then they come and look for your issues that you have. Meanwhile, in Europe, you just want to say, I want to open a restaurant, and then all of them already, do you have that? Do you have that permit? Do you have that allowance? Do you have that? Do you have that? Do you have that? And then you'll be like, how much is this going to cost? And that's it. You're going to think twice. When you think twice in doing a business, you're already below the curve. And you're gone. Another issue. EU spends not that much when it comes to R&D correlated with GDP. And it's a big problem. Because although I said in the beginning the Chinese with Xiaomi and Huawei, they are cheating and then they're developing products, at least they're doing it at a better pace than the Europeans. The Japanese are the best in this case, the Koreans the same, and the Americans are there. Now, unfortunately, most of the R&D spent by the Americans, it's state-pushed, privately financed. Meanwhile, in Europe, it's state-pushed, state-financed, which is kind of bad. Now, something macro. That's why the Americans actually pushed on for tariffs. It's not about the fact that they want everything to be made in the USA. It's about the fact that they have a $700 billion deficit. And they want somehow that to be reduced to zero. Meanwhile, the EU has $100 billion in surplus. Now, those 100 billion euros, is actually the German economy. So, although the German economy has some issues, at this moment, it still performs the best in the European Union, and France is second best. Meanwhile, the Chinese economy, they produce everything. Long live Shein and Temu, right? $800 billion euros in surplus. So that's why the Americans, they push for tariffs. It's not only just because they want to have those products made in the US, which is a weird approach, because people think if they will build everything in the US, that means more jobs. No. The wages are so high in the US right now that Apple tried to do this. In first term of Donald Trump, Apple pushed for the idea to have a factory made in Texas. And they realized if they have this factory built there, the labor is so expensive that they couldn't sell at a profit a MacBook, because that's what they were producing there. And they selected the idea that they will only produce customized products. Why? Because their price tag could go up to $50,000. And when it goes up to $50,000, the hardware is at most $8,000 or $9,000 from the entire price tag. And you can afford having $2,000 or $3,000 in labor in that product than trying to sell an entry-level MacBook in which, if you add on the labor, it's more expensive to produce than to sell. Another problem of the EU, which is the result of the Ukrainian war, is the only market where foreign direct investments flees. As you can see, China has a surplus last year of 162 billion, the US 192, and the EU has a minus in front of the value. Money flees war zones all the time. That's the problem. When you have a 3-year period of wars, the Ukrainian war, it means cashing out. This is how the European economy looks like actually. You have 17 trillion euros agriculture. By the way, the biggest subsidies you can have in the market are in the agricultural sector, although it's the smallest market, smallest producer. Meanwhile, services are the key player in the EU. I didn't compare to the American economy because their economy is built different. They don't have so many services because they are injected in the industrial path. Why? Because of the IT companies. Those companies emulate everything, and that's why you cannot compare them. And you know what counts the most is actually the investment part, because that's what really produces something in the European Union. And this is how we invest as a union. 1 trillion from us, 0.5 trillion from the government, and 2.2 trillion from the corporate sector. Well, for the American side, those 2.2 trillion, it's actually 7. And this is one of the issues why productivity is an issue for the European Union. Because we lag behind delivering the best options we can have as a tool to grow. And this is COVID. The fun part is that COVID, when it came, it reshuffled the cards, and it actually made the EU more competitive than the US. But it's not seen in the charts because the US, they use the ultimate card, evaluating their currency at a higher pace than normal. So that's why we lose the battle with the Americans right now. And that's why we need to put Europe first. And maybe somehow we should postpone for a while the data protection regulation and the climate change regulation, just to get at the American level again. We have to choose between stagnation or greatness, and at the end of the day, we need the courage to reform, to actually reform and take the necessary measures to solve the situation. Thanks.